How evil was Queen Elizabeth's historic sacrifice for Indigenous rights? Queen Elizabeth II played a pivotal role in championing Indigenous rights, demonstrating a commitment that aligned with her broader responsibilities as monarch. Her influence extended beyond mere ceremonial duties, actively engaging in significant political issues. Before 1982, the political climate around Indigenous rights in Canada was tense and often overlooked. Indigenous communities faced systemic barriers, and their rights were not adequately represented in national policies or discussions. Early in her reign, Queen Elizabeth became aware of the challenges facing Indigenous populations. This awareness was sparked by her visits to Commonwealth countries, where she met directly with Indigenous leaders and communities. The Canada Act of 1982 marked a historic shift in the treatment and recognition of Indigenous rights within Canada. This legislation not only affirmed the rights of Indigenous peoples but also solidified Canada's legislative independence from Britain. Queen Elizabeth's support for the Canada Act of 1982 was crucial in promoting the autonomy of Indigenous tribes. Her backing helped to ensure that Indigenous communities could have greater control over their lands and cultural heritage. Queen Elizabeth's personal visits to Canada were significant in fostering mutual respect and understanding. Her engagements with Indigenous communities highlighted her commitment to learning about their cultures and traditions firsthand. Her influence was pivotal during the enactment of the Canada Act of 1982, which notably enhanced the legislative independence of Canada. This act was a cornerstone in redefining the relationship between the government and Indigenous peoples. The Canada Act not only solidified Canada's autonomy but also had implications for Indigenous tribes, granting them a greater voice in their own affairs. This empowerment was a direct result of the Queen's advocacy for fair and respectful treatment. In the broader context of colonial and post-colonial Indigenous affairs, the monarchy's role has been complex. However, Queen Elizabeth's actions demonstrated a progressive stance for the times, often advocating for the rights and recognition of Indigenous communities. Indigenous leaders' reactions to the Canada Act were mixed, but many acknowledged Queen Elizabeth's role in advancing their cause. Her support helped to spotlight Indigenous issues on a national and international level. Queen Elizabeth's influence extended beyond Canada, shaping Indigenous policies in other Commonwealth nations. Her advocacy highlighted the importance of recognizing Indigenous rights within these countries' legal frameworks, promoting a wider global awareness. Public opinions in Canada and the UK varied regarding the Queen's role in Indigenous matters. While some viewed her as a figurehead without real influence, others appreciated her efforts to promote dialogue and understanding. The Canada Act's legacy continues to impact the relationship between Indigenous communities and the Canadian government. It laid the groundwork for ongoing negotiations and reforms aimed at achieving greater autonomy and rights recognition. Queen Elizabeth consistently championed Indigenous rights throughout her reign, extending her influence beyond the Canada Act. Her engagements with Indigenous leaders and communities underscored a commitment to their welfare and cultural preservation. Criticism of the monarchy's involvement in Indigenous issues often centers on historical grievances and perceived inadequacies in addressing systemic injustices. These controversies highlight complex relationships between colonial legacies and contemporary Indigenous rights advocacy. Queen Elizabeth's advocacy for Indigenous rights extended beyond the Canada Act, involving numerous initiatives and public statements that highlighted her commitment to these communities throughout her reign. Criticism of the monarchy's involvement with Indigenous issues often centers on the historical implications of colonialism. Some argue that the Crown's efforts, though well-intentioned, cannot fully atone for past injustices. The historical context of Britain's legislative control over Canada is profound, marking a period of significant political and cultural imposition, which influenced the lives of Indigenous peoples across the nation. The Canada Act not only reshaped Canadian governance but also set a precedent for how former British colonies addressed Indigenous rights, inspiring legislative reforms and greater recognition of Indigenous autonomy. Queen Elizabeth's enduring impact on Indigenous rights is a testament to her legacy in modern governance, reflecting a nuanced balance between traditional monarchy roles and contemporary societal values.